So if you would like to go ahead and introduce yourself with your name, how long you've lived in the area, and any other first introduction you'd like to make.
My name is Robert Michael Doyle. My family and friends call me Mike Doyle. I was born and raised in Douglas County, about 30 miles south of here, a totally rural county. I graduated from Arcola High School in 1964 and came to the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign as a 17-year-old freshman. At that time, in the pre-Stonewall era, there was no gay groups, no openly gay people. I don't know of anyone else at that time in my high school or in my town who was gay, or at the U of I. There was nothing. I attended school off and on for about 7 years, but never got a degree. I majored in history and minored in political science. I did manage, as a manager of the U of I football team, to get an I from the U of I, but I did not get a degree. I stayed in the community, working at various minor jobs. But in 1975, in about 1970 or 71 was the first gay group in town, the Gay Liberation Front. I did not have anything to do with them except I attended one event and had a large crowd and just stood in the back and listened. I never got involved with them. I read about them in the paper. I did gradually come to more acceptance of myself. My main problem was always religious. I was and am a practicing Catholic. There were differences between, for example, my church does not believe that there's anything wrong with being gay. You're just not supposed to have any sex with anybody outside of marriage, and they of course do not accept and still campaign against same-sex marriage. Anyway, in about 75, after coming out to my parents and a few other people, receiving support from 2 priests and a sister at St. John's Catholic Chapel on campus, I went to my first Gay Illini event. They were then called Gay Students Alliance. They had just reformed themselves February 12, 1975. And in April, I went to an event and also paid my first visit to a deliberate gay bar. They did not meet that summer, but then the fall, I went to them to talk about forming a gay Christian group. There was a priest willing to work on that with me, and discovered that they were a very open group, open to anybody, whether you were affiliated with the university or not. They were not hostile to religion, which is what I was expecting, and so as a result, I became involved with them. And as they got more formally organized and wrote a constitution, I told them that I wanted to seek the office of male co-president, and I was elected the second male co-president. And then it was, from then on, I was a very active gay activist on the campus and Champaign-Urbana in the area.
So you mentioned that in 75 was when you came out. As you know, the Human Rights Ordinance passed in Urbana that included safety for LGBT individuals in 75, and then in Champaign in 77. What was that like? Were you involved with that activism?
Neither I or anyone else in Gay Students Alliance, Gay Illini, was involved with the passage of the Urbana Ordinance. Preparation had been made by people in Gay Liberation Front by attempting to pass something and failing to do so. They did succeed in getting the ban on cross-dressing abolished in the 2 cities. But they were unable to pass something prohibiting discrimination. However, they had presented the idea to the community. Some people working on their own were successful in passing the 1975 Urbana Human Rights Ordinance. However, by the time I became co-president of Gay Illini, I decided that we needed to be more political. One of the things that was good about that group was people were in it for a variety of reasons. But the people who were in it for strictly social reasons or to meet people were happy to support those of us who were political and wanted to use the organization for political purposes. And so I was very pleased with that because it fulfilled my social needs, but also was something to work from for political change, which I was very much interested in. After all, I did minor in political science, and my family was involved in politics in Douglas County. So I did work on and was very much instrumental, along with certain other people, in getting the Champaign Ordinance passed in '77. That ordinance was much more comprehensive than the original Urbana one, and included gender identity as well as sexual orientation, although those weren't not the actual words used at the time, but the legal meaning was the same. As a result of that, we then worked to get the Urbana Ordinance rewritten, so that it matched the Champaign Ordinance and covered as many categories. And I'm still to this day very pleased with the large number of categories that got included, and that reasonable exceptions were included. Like, for example, in housing, if you're actually going to live in the place being rented and share a kitchen or a bathroom with a renter, you could discriminate for any reason. Because I could see gay people not wanting to live with straight people and so forth, as long as it was that personal of a relationship. So like I said, I'm still very pleased with those ordinances. And they are still in effect with only minor changes over the years.
So you mentioned the work with the Gay Illini group that was open to students and non-students alike. What were some other organizations or LGBT safe spaces within the community?
In the beginning, Gay Liberation Front and Gay Students Alliance, which became Gay Illini, were the only ones in town. But very shortly after, in fact, the first year I think I was involved, a local women-only group, lesbian-only group called Lavender Prairie Collective formed. They began publishing a newsletter called Lavender Prairie News, which lasted for quite a number of years, monthly. They held monthly get-togethers for women only. Some of the men of Gay Illini provided childcare for those events. I'm very proud of that. So that was the first diversion, or splitting in the community. Of course, there were many more later. Some women were active in Gay Illini. We always tried to have a woman co-president. I think there was only a couple of years where it wasn't possible. There were women who refused to have anything to do with us, with men at all, and others who worked with men. The 70s, especially the late 70s when this was all occurring, was a time of a great separatist, lesbian separatist movement throughout the United States. So we were not unusual in that.
So you mentioned that there was a split between men and women within the LGBT community. So what about other organizations on campus or social movements?
We were generally allied with or in cahoots with various liberal and leftist groups, and not with rightist groups. Although every time we did candidates and forums and stuff, we made sure we invited all candidates regardless of their position. Occasionally some Republicans did come to our candidates forum and did not agree with us on what we wanted. Eventually, some of it was splitting over categories. For example, eventually a faculty staff group formed, which worked with. For a long time, the groups did work together, and for a long time, when I had the time to do it, I attended the meetings of everybody that I could. Obviously, I didn't go to women-only meetings, and would carry news back and forth between the groups. And so I did have a view of what else was going on. I even attended one open meeting of the Gay Alcoholics Anonymous.
So what was the church that you were working with to try and make a queer-friendly Christian group?
Oh, well, the person I was working with was a Catholic priest who belonged to a religious order and therefore was somewhat freer than a diocesan priest would have been to work on something like that. We did eventually have a dignity chapter here and an integrity chapter. There were two different Metropolitan Community Church congregations here, but the main thing that happened was we have a number of Protestant churches on campus or close to campus that are very gay supportive. And certainly for Protestants, there's no need to have a separate church organization, although certainly discussion groups remain to this very day for religiously inclined people. The Catholic situation is that large numbers of lay persons and even priests and religious are gay supportive. They operate under the radar because the bishop, particularly the Bishop of Peoria, this is in the Peoria Diocese, is opposed to gay rights, and the national collection of bishops is opposed, and of course the Vatican is opposed. But that seems to be the trend throughout the Western nations of the Catholic Church, of laity being much more liberal on the gay issue than the church leadership. However, that does not necessarily reflect the whole church. The church has 1 billion members, with many of them in places like Latin America, Africa, Asia, where it is impossible to know the exact feelings of the laity there.
So within the first entity of a resource center that was housed within the YMCA on campus, they also created a switchboard, a hotline for people to call. Did you ever work with either the center as a volunteer or the hotline?
I worked with all three of our major, besides our social aspect and our political aspect, our social service aspect was in 3 divisions: the gay switchboard, or gay and lesbian switchboard, the Gay and Lesbian Resource Center, and the Gay and Lesbian Speakers Bureau. And so I worked with all 3 of those and was involved in forming all 3 of those. The Resource Center ended up in the Illini Union when we got an office space in the Illini Union for the Gay Illini. Incidentally, the Gay Illini changed to Gay and Lesbian Illini, Lesbian and Gay Illini, People for Lesbian, Gay, and Bisexual Concerns, Pride, and I think that's the name they have today. Anyway, they have been in continuous existence as a registered university organization from 1975.
So what were some of the calls, or what was the most common call that you would get?
The switchboard began before there were a lot of things that people are used to now. We got people calling who now would call an 800 number, a 900 number. Sexual, they just wanted to jack off while talking to a real gay person. We discouraged that. There was people wanting to know where the cruising places were in town. And we had that information. Some of our volunteers, especially the women, were not interested in giving it out. So our rule was that if they asked for that information, you could either give it to them, or you could tell them to call on another night and talk to a volunteer willing to give it to them. We were especially on top of the cruising situation because there was a period of fag bashings in one of the major cruising places. That was eventually ended by the police themselves. When they actually caught someone, they were prosecuted and convicted, and that ended that. I'm sure that the perpetrators just didn't expect that to happen. We had the Gay Speakers Bureau had a set, and maybe to this day still does, arrangement to speak at every basic human sexuality course offered on campus. And Barbara Gettings, who was famous as an early activist, visited campus twice, and she said we may have been the only group at that time with that arrangement, with a university department. So I spoke at a number of those classes in the old days.
So you mentioned the police working or catching someone who had committed a gay bashing. There were articles that I had read that mentioned police cooperation. How was police cooperation with students and residents here that identified as LGBT? I
should mention that actually in the days of the Gay Liberation Front, there was still harassment by the police of gay people and harassment of gay gathering places. It was that by the time I got involved, that had ended more or less. When we first marched in the 4th of July parade, we did not receive adequate protection because of a particular police officer that was homophobic and did not think we ought to be in the parade. However, once I brought the situation to the attention of the higher city officials, that ended. But the police, we felt comfortable going to the police. I certainly did. And of course now there is a high-level open lesbian officer in the Champaign Police Department. She may not be open to the general public, but she's definitely open to the police department. Obviously there have been gay people on both city councils, so the police know, you know, they are actually supervised by gay people.
So there was mention of a bar, something, or some sort of restaurant that had the name something Robin?
Round Robin.
Round Robin. So there was some sort of mention of
I'm sorry.
people being harassed?
It was the Wigwam, which became the Round Robin later. But as the Wigwam, it was the informal gathering place for gay students in the early 70s. And at some point, the ownership, which was a married couple, an older married couple, decided they didn't want the gay business anymore, and they deliberately harassed the clientele. The same thing happened there was a bar in the Inman Hotel called the Crystal Room, which was also a gathering place. And that place decided they wanted to get rid of their gay clientele. Fortunately, at the same time, in 75, a professor at the U of I, used his sabbatical to open the first deliberate gay bar in town called the Balloon Saloon. So that partly solved that problem of just everybody went to the deliberate gay bar. One of the main activists the Gay Liberation Front did picket the Wigwam. There was police harassment of that picket, and nothing was done about it, even though the people did tried to go to higher authorities over the police, but nothing was done. It turns out that the police officer who was doing the main harassing, was the son of an elected city official, and it's believed that that's why nothing was done.
So you mentioned the Balloon Saloon. Was there a church that was upstairs?
Yes. The first Metropolitan Communities Church met upstairs above the Balloon Saloon on Sundays. And I went once or twice.
And was that was it friendly to lesbians and gays?
Oh yeah, certainly. It was an MCC, which is now an international church for gay and lesbian people. And that was established in the late 60s by Troy Perry, Reverend Troy Perry.
There has been mention in the archives, in one news article in particular, that Champaign-Urbana was quite a scene to go to when it came to nightlife, and that even people from, say, Indianapolis or St. Louis and the surrounding area in Illinois would come here on a Friday or Saturday night. And so this seems very contradictory to this sort of metropolitan-centered society we live in, where it almost seems like you have to flee to the city to find community and find LGBT-friendly spaces. So
but first of all, you got to remember that for persons like myself and elsewhere in East Central Illinois, Champaign-Urbana is the big city compared to Arcola and places like Filson, which had a population of 50, and I met the one gay person who lived there. Anyway, in about sometime around 1980, the bar was open, and that was where Chester Street is now, and it was a very large space. The space had been a popular fraternity sorority bar until it was closed because of a wet t-shirt contest that got out of hand. And that was extremely popular, and people did come to it, and it was jam-packed with totally gay crowds. It now gets a large straight crowd, but then it got a totally gay crowd, and it was extremely popular, and people did come down from Chicago. He brought down performers from Chicago, too. And so, yes, we did draw people here on the weekends from all kinds of places. That's not our scene now, but it was then. It was very, and of course, that continued on into the AIDS era. But of course, that put a whole different look on everything, feel, and so forth.
So there were many bars mentioned, such as the Balloon Saloon, Giovanni's, and the bar, and then which later became Chester Street. What were the differences between the bars in regards to atmosphere, or what you were looking for?
Every time there was 2 or more bars, and once there was 3 bars at the same time, some people would be only going to one and would disparage the other, where many of us just went back and forth. Sometimes one bar would have the more lesbian crowd than the other one. There were also at least one time when a straight bar had a gay night. I don't know how to, every time we had a bar, I tried to be a regular at any gay and lesbian bar we had. And the time we had 3, I followed a little trajectory. I went to the mostly lesbian bar, the Moonlighter first, and then to the bar, and then we had another one on Green Street at that time, which went through 3 different names. And each time a new bar would open, they'd get a very large crowd at the beginning. And so the Max was its first name, and then it was, I forgot the other 2 names. But all of them would be popular for when they first opened, and then it would kind of work out as to whether they stayed popular and replaced an earlier bar, or they failed and then the other bar remained. Chester Street now has been there 28 years.
So outside of the nightlife, were there other, say, like bookstores, coffee shops,
Oh, yes.
other locations that were very LGBT friendly?
I don't know about coffee shops because I don't frequent them, although there are now obviously a large number of places in town which are gay friendly. Adult bookstores were always places for gay men to go to for cruising. I don't know of any adult bookstore ever in this town that wasn't a cruising place. And some of the early straight bars that became gay friendly were like the Esquire in downtown Champaign. Apparently, Bunny's became lesbian friendly early on. My mind is hazy about some of these other places, but yes, they were places. And whenever coffee shops became gay friendly, I don't know because I wasn't going to them, but obviously at some point it happened. Jane Aven's bookstore was a very gay friendly space and hosted gay gatherings there around the books, of course, and brought in speakers. Campus places, the university, the church foundations that were gay friendly had coffee houses. That's the kind of coffee house I forgot completely about. I was thinking of the commercial ones. The non-commercial ones, the Channing Murray Foundation on campus with the Red Herring had a gay coffee house. It was sponsored by the Gay Illini, but it went on for weekly for several years. It was moved to McKinley Presbyterian Foundation, went on there for a number of years. Now the gay-friendly coffee house is in the Wesley Foundation, the United Methodist Foundation. So yes, certainly when school's in session, we've always had weekly gay-friendly coffee houses.
What was on the agenda for those meetings? Was it mostly social or also political?
The early Gay Illini was very informal. We sat in a circle. We introduced ourselves with the caveat that you may use any name you want. If you use a pseudonym, please be consistent from week to week. We actually said that. We chose a different chairperson for every meeting. And so for some people, part of their coming out process and getting comfortable was the first time that they were willing to chair the meeting. The agenda consisted of, we had always specified we had to have a blackboard, and people just said what should be on the agenda. Anyone could put anything on the agenda. It was written on the blackboard, and the chair led us through each agenda item. The only officers we had was the two that the university required. There had to be a president and there had to be a treasurer. The treasurer was the only true officer because he actually took care of the money. And the founder of Gay Illini was the original treasurer. The president was just someone willing to have his name on the form. He did not preside over anything. He occasionally was a chair, of course, but that was just like anyone else. We eventually became more formal and adopted a constitution and co-presidents, treasurer, secretary, and organized our switchboard resource center and speakers bureau more formally. What would be the theme? The only meetings that would have themes is if we brought in somebody ahead of time, planned ahead of time, to either have a candidates forum or have a speaker on some subject. But even with those kind of things, we usually spent a half hour on the open agenda and then went to the organized program. So you never knew what might come up. Because it was extremely democratic, extremely participatory.
So from the origin of these sorts of groups, how quickly or how many people started coming? So how long did it take for there to be like consistent numbers and to grow larger?
That's a good question because I wasn't there at the very beginning of Gay Illini. And of course, that first summer they didn't meet. That's the other thing that I introduced strongly, was that we meet every Sunday. And the only Sunday we had to miss was the Illini Union, was traditionally closed between Christmas and New Year's. But even if we had absolutely no business whatsoever to transact, we would meet, have a short meeting, and then the social was the important thing. Because at the end of every meeting, we would figure out where the social was going to be. What it consisted of was someone had to offer their place that night to host it. And when somebody did, and some people planned ahead, we then broke up the meeting, arranged for people who didn't have rides to get rides to the house or apartment. We would stop and buy stuff because it was a bring your own. Everything was bring your own. The host was not expected to provide anything, although some of them planned ahead and did. And we were in some tiny spaces sometimes, jam-packed. But there were people who were not the least bit interested in the program who came to the meeting only so they could find out where the social was. And we accepted that because all of us who were political and otherwise socially service-oriented wanted the socials too. It's what kept us going.
Sorry, I had something. So, what do you do now to stay active within the community?
I'm much less active than I used to be. Part of it was I dropped out completely during the later years of my parents and their death. And then I inherited their house in Arcola, so I spent half my time in Arcola until I sold the house just a year and a half ago. Now I'm trying to become more active by mainly working through the Up Center. We did have another gay community center called Outpost several years ago, which was successful for a while, and then people lost interest in it, and we closed it. It was closed down in an orderly fashion. I must admit that when there was the proposal to start this Up Center, I had my doubts that it would go anywhere. But I have discovered that it's really well organized, and I have high hopes for it to be a successful continuing organization. And for that reason, I decided to do more with it. I didn't want to be this old person who said to younger people, "Oh, we've tried that, it didn't work." Because that just, well, you especially learn not to do that in a campus community. Because there's always new people with new ideas, and things that didn't used to work suddenly do work.
So are there any sorts of experiences that you would like to share with current and future generations of youth?
I want to point out to all young people that the whole gay movement was started by us and maintained by us. Nowadays, we get all kinds of support from straight organizations and institutions, and of course the university maintains the Center for Lesbian and Gay Bisexual Concerns. But I want to warn young people, you do not need that. We didn't have it, and we managed to get things started. And remember, there was a very successful gay movement in post-World War Germany, and it was completely crushed by the Nazis. Now, I do not expect that kind of extreme turnaround, but do not rely on the straight community too much. Remember, you have the resources to save yourselves. We did, and you can too.
That's a great message. So with all of the interaction and the idea of pseudonyms and other sorts of interactions, do you still feel that there was a community that was built, even though, or a sense of community, even with sorts of barriers that may have existed?
I believe we had a greater, those of us who were out and involved had a greater sense of community then, because we hadn't started breaking down into the subgroups. Now, I understand that breaking down the subgroups is a logical progression, simply because there's more of us out. People do have these separate interests and separate concerns. And also, since we've made a lot of progress, people can worry about other things besides gay liberation. But I think there was a sense of community. And at that time, the whole thing with pseudonyms and being in the closet and not necessarily acknowledging in public that you knew somebody was the accepted standing in the gay community. We'd all grown up under repression, severe repression. And so there's all these techniques for dealing with it. And so we all cooperated on that. We recognized that people use pseudonyms. We recognized that people might, I told people that if you didn't greet me on the street, I would understand, because of course after I became co-president, I was very out in the newspaper and stuff, on television. And so I could see that somebody, to my knowledge, it never happened. But I understood if it would have happened.
So with that sort of idea of people hiding their identity versus exposing, there were a few events mentioned, such as like the gays wear jeans day on campus.
I think that was our most fun thing. All we did was put up and by the way, we got the idea from someplace else. Some small college elsewhere had done it. We thought it was a great idea, so we decided to do it as part of our first Gay Awareness Days. And all we did was we put up signs around campus that said, if you're gay, wear blue jeans on Tuesday or whatever date it was. And that's all we did. We just put up the signs. And we had scheduled that a typical gay speakers bureau event in the South Lounge of the Atlanta Union, and we expected at that point in time to explain the idea behind the whole thing. Because, of course, it is illogical to say that if you're wearing blue jeans, you're gay. But we knew that people would think that way. And so, of course, huge numbers of straight people, and probably closeted gays, did not wear blue jeans on that day. And at that time, blue jeans were much more popular than they are now. So it was a noticeable change. What we was not expecting was the huge amount of publicity we got from the regular media. I was the male co-president, and a woman who was still in town was the woman co-president. She was out to one parent, but not the other. She was from Chicago. She was woke up early in the morning by a phone call from one of the Chicago newspapers, major Chicago newspapers, wanting to know all about this. If you're gay, wear blue jeans day. So she gave an interview over the phone. Later, when she was more awake, she realized what she'd done. So she called the parent that she was out to, and that parent hid that newspaper from the other parent. Then she called me and said what had happened, and we agreed from then on I would be the spokesperson, because we realized we were going to get more publicity than we expected. So throughout that day I gave interviews, And there was the television cameras on campus, just for this, if you're gay, wear Blue Jays Day. I ended up being on National Public Radio. I never heard myself. I was interviewed by Pacifica Radio from the West Coast. I must admit, I'm very proud of something very personal. I came up to our office before going to lunch with a group of the members, including one who I had an extreme crush on, and was told that this radio station wanted to interview me. I said, I'm going to lunch. And I skipped the interview and I went to lunch because I thought to myself, the whole point of this is being proud and happy about your sexual identity, and I'm going to lunch with this guy. Well, it worked out wonderfully because I came back up an hour later and they were on the phone again. So I gave them the interview over the phone. So I got to do both things. I got to affirm my sexuality the way I wanted to and still give the interview.
So you mentioned on Sunday the idea of someone occupying a courthouse, or...
Oh. The main activist for the Gay Liberation Front had left town by the time I became active, and he became an activist in Chicago. He was the one that was seriously harassed by the police officer, and that the police had not done the Urbana police had not done anything about it, and we believe it's because the police officer's father was an elected city official. He was still bothered by this whole incident. So he came back on his own without contacting any of us here and began a sit-in in the lobby of the Urbana City Building. By that time, Urbana had passed the Human Rights Ordinance. He didn't even know that when he came. We had a pro-gay mayor who arranged for him to be accommodated, to stay overnight in the lobby and everything, and kind of live there, and have food and drink brought to him and stuff. And the police kept an eye on him, because they were also worried that somebody might attack him. There was, of course, publicity in the local newspaper. Gay Line was taken completely by surprise. I went over and talked to him a little bit. I don't think I told him I was, representing Gay Line in any way. I just checked. I decided there was no way for us to become involved because the statute of limitations had expired on that police officer's wrongdoing. Plus, the police officer was no longer with the force. So we did not become involved. But he did get a lot of publicity, and he did end the sit-in when the mayor made a public statement that, yes, he had been mistreated by the police, and the city was sorry that had happened, that nothing could be done about it but because of statute of limitations, and that the police officer was no longer with the city. So he was satisfied with that, and he returned to Chicago, where he remained an activist for many years. And he's written a novel that tells that whole story, and it's called, it's a very good novel. I'm not supposed to name anything on this, or name any people. And meanwhile, we were working out our own close relationships with city officials. And that was the very night that I had the mayor of Champaign scheduled to meet with us, that Sunday meeting while he was sitting in. And as a result of that was the beginning of the work for the passage of the Champaign Human Rights Ordinance that following summer. So we were doing our work while he was doing the sit-in. I consider both to be contributions to the cause. They each have their place.
What was it like when the mayors of Champaign and Urbana came together and declared a National Pride Day?
Well, Lesbian and Gay Pride Day, yes. I was the one who arranged that, and I did it quietly because I wanted a joint proclamation. I did not want a single city. The two mayors were of opposite parties, and that was another reason I wanted a joint proclamation. So I asked each of them separately, and if one of them had turned me down, I would have not said anything about it publicly. They both agreed. I carefully pointed out to them that the Stonewall event that I mentioned in the proclamation was a riot against the police. I wanted them to be prepared for every possible, objection to the content of the proclamation. They issued the proclamation. I gave copies of it to the newspaper. Nothing happened. One of my co-conspirators sent a copy of the proclamation to one of the local churches that was famous for its hostility to both gay people and to porno places. That created the uproar. That minister, created a big fuss about it. And it was a huge fuss, with letters to the editor on both sides and everything. And the mayors stood their ground. One of them wrote a very good piece defending the proclamation. The other mayor said, if I hadn't thought this proclamation was worthwhile when I issued it, I certainly do now, after hearing all this uproar and all this prejudice in the community. And so I was very pleased with what they did. And I was happy with the publicity. I was sad about the amount of hostility. There was even hostility on the Champaign City Council. Some of them actually seriously considered taking away from the mayor the right to issue proclamations. But when they found out how many different people requested proclamations, and of course none of the rest of them were controversial, they decided they didn't want to deal with it. It would have tied up too much council time. And so, from then on, the proclamations were issued annually, regularly, until a mayor came in. One of those cities had a mayor who would not issue proclamations on any controversial proclamation, he said. But then he's out of office, and we're back to getting proclamations from both mayors. So I'm happy.
So we've got about probably 5 minutes before people are going to start coming for Man Up. Is there anything else that you would like to say or talk about?
I am very pleased that I was born and lived when I did, because my lifetime spans from pre-Stonewall to now, when it is quite clear we're winning. We're going to win. There will always be a small number of people who hate gay people for whatever reason. But it's quite clear that eventually the majority of people are going to, and we're going to have everything. We're going to have gay marriage. We're going to have everything. And so I'm very pleased that I had a part in it, that I actually helped. Now, I did not do anything that wasn't done by countless other people throughout the United States and throughout the world. And I had no real new ideas of my own. Everything that like the Blue Jeans Day, we got it from somebody else. But I'm very pleased that I got to do all of that.
Well, thank you very much.
So, do I get the part?